Good afternoon, and welcome to our afternoon session. As you may know, the city of South Bend, first let me introduce myself. My name is Father Terry Ehrman. I'm a Holy Cross priest and a visiting professor in the Theology department here. And for those who may not know, the city of South Bend is named for the sinuous reach of the St. Joseph River, whose point of inflection occurs here as the water abruptly turns north to flow into Lake Michigan, about 40 miles away. And the river and the surrounding watershed of which we are a part lies within the outwash of the Wisconsin glaciation, which retreated northward about 13,000 years ago. The area was then revegetated by conifer forest, and later, around 8,000 years ago, by deciduous forest. And most recently, that is 3,000 years ago, western grasslands migrated into the area, thereby forming the eastern extension of what's known as the Prairie Peninsula. This portion of the upper Midwestern U.S. is now a transition zone between eastern deciduous forest and western prairie. Ecological boundaries, such as those between these two biomes, at a large scale are important and interesting areas of research in terms of their origin, causes, changes, interactions, functions, and history. Ecological boundaries, of course, encompass a range of scales from biomes to the root soil or rhizosphere level. It's fitting at this boundary of these two biomes that our next speaker, Professor Celia Deanne-Drummond, is our speaker because she has forged a career that one might say is a life at the boundaries. She began her academic career with a doctorate in plant physiology and has published over 30 scientific articles with a major focus on nitrate uptake by algal cells and pea plants. After a dozen years of primarily botanical research, she then expanded the breadth of her studies to include a new boundary condition, that between science and theology. She earned a doctorate in systematic theology and since then has published extensively in that boundary relationship between biology and theology. She has been, since 2011, full professor of theology here in the College of Arts and Letters, with a uniquely concurrent appointment in the College of Science. She's also a fellow of the Eck Institute for Global Health here at Notre Dame. And currently, this academic year of 2012-13, she is a co-senior research fellow for the Center of Theological Inquiry at Princeton University to facilitate interdisciplinary dialogue among 12 scholars in the fields of evolutionary biology, psychology, anthropology, religious studies, and philosophy of science. And next year, she is one of 4 editors who will be launching a new interdisciplinary journal, Philosophy, Theology, and Science. In addition to her scientific publications, Professor Deanne-Drummond has in the last 21 years published or edited 22 books, authored 33 contributions to books, and published 45 articles. Some of her recent book titles include Genetics and Christian Ethics in 2006. In 2009, both Christ and Evolution, Wonder and Wisdom, and Creaturely Theology, God, Humans, and Other Animals. Back in 2008, she published Eco-Theology. And in that work, she described the boundary of ecology and theology as theology worked out at the coalface, as it were, of environmental concerns and problems. Professor Deanne-Drummond's intellectual inquiry is also coupled with an ecclesial and public service boundary. She has served as an expert on various committees, including the Roman Catholic Bishops' Committee of England and Wales, and the Catholic Agency for Overseas Development in the area of environmental justice and climate change. This afternoon, we shall benefit from Professor Celia Deanne-Drummond's intellectual analysis of the boundary between ecology and theology as she presents in her Irenic style on the topic of climate change and Catholic social teaching.
Thank you very much for that really generous introduction, and It's a great pleasure and a delight to be here with you this afternoon. I would like to thank the organisers for explicitly inviting me to come back for Princeton to this event. So, Catholic social teaching. I just want to, before I start, give a word of clarification about the limits of my particular talk this afternoon. I'm limiting Catholic social teaching to official encyclicals and letters. I'm not going to deal with the US Bishop's report on climate change and the common good, which is going to come up later in the panel session, as far as I understand it. And I'm also not going to detail a wider theological development, including my own particular theological input on environmental ethics. Because the reason I'm doing this is because I want to argue for a map of official teaching and an orientation, as it were, for theologians and others to think through what it means to be Catholic but also concerned about environmental problems. And I hope to convince you by the end of this afternoon that this is a concern not just for the specialist or for those who happen to have been ecologists or scientists at one stage in their career, but for every Christian, every person who attends Mass. This has to be a vital part of their concern for Christian discipleship. I'm also not going to go into the details of the science, because that was covered admirably yesterday by the scientists in the community, or map out what it might mean for policy making, because that's on for tomorrow's session. So what am I going to do then? First, I'm going to talk about a particular interpretation of climate change in terms of what's been argued as the sign, or called the signs of the times. Then I'm going to look at historical aspects of Catholic social teaching, because the concern for the environment isn't some new concern that's come up maybe with the inauguration of Pope Francis, but it's been there for many years, about the same time that secularists were thinking about environmental issues. And the theological mandate of these of environmental concerns comes in the writing of Pope John Paul II. Then I'm going to look at the explicit way in which Catholic social teaching joins ecology and development in a way which I think was actually fairly innovative for the time, because traditionally these two areas or ethical areas have been kept separated. But in Catholic social teaching they come together in a way that reinforce one another. And then I'm going to look at ecological conversion. We heard in the last session about this idea of repentance, ecological or anthropogenic sin. But ecological conversion is part of Pope John Paul II's brief on environmental questions. And then finally, ecology, justice and world peace, where I mention the work of Benedict XVI and also touch on some of the recent speeches that we've had from Pope Francis. I realise this is a fairly whistle-stop tour of the area, but I hope it'll give you some idea of where Catholic social teaching is in relation to ecology. So first of all then, the signs of the times, not just the iconic images of floating ice caps, but also in Catholic terms, according to Catholic social teaching, the collective consciousness of social concern at the time. When it was first coined by Pope John XXIII, the principal characteristic of the age was known as that arose up in the collective consciousness was thought to be the signs of the times. And in his case, it was the nuclear war issue. In his encyclical Pacem in Terris, written in 1963, the nuclear war issue was named as the signs of the times. In Gaudium et Spes, which again were in 1965, part of the Vatican II statements on the role of the Church in the world, the duty of the Church was to identify what these signs might be. And I would say that one of the signs of the times is now climate change. However much it's resisted or turned away from, it is, if you like, there in our public consciousness, whether we choose to ignore it or not. Climate change, again, generates cultural anxieties that seem particularly, that seem worse than environmental questions more generally. So climate change is at a global scale in a way that some environmental problems in the past have not seemed to be at such a global scale. In other words, climate change is about the environmental problem writ large, globally as well as locally. So there are local impacts, but there's also global considerations. And it's one of the reasons why climate change is so difficult for people to appreciate, is because it's the action that I take may seem insignificant compared to the impact that it might make in terms of changing climate change. The window for carbon emissions reduction is, of course, narrowing according to the scientists. The IPCC latest report on sea level rise seems to have been underestimated according to the most recent update reports on that. Residual carbon, as we heard yesterday, may take thousands of years for it to come to equilibrium if we rely on current estimates of even the actual carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere today, never mind what we might put into the future. So all this generates a feeling of anxiety and a feeling of crisis, a feeling almost of apocalypse, to use the biblical language. And the crisis is so deep now that even some scientists are starting to use religious language because they are despairing of their own ability to convince the public of the need to take action. Information alone on climate change, then, is never going to be enough to change hearts and minds. And Habermas, or Jürgen Habermas, who is a philosopher who for years has resisted religious discourse in the public sphere, has now claimed that the crisis in modernity is such that we need to turn to religious notions of solidarity in order to help find the solutions to the particular problems of our age. I believe this opens the window then, opens the doors for theologians and others, and Catholic social teaching in particular, to speak into the public sphere in a way that perhaps wasn't possible in the past. And the immediate response of the theologian is bound to be the unethical one, witnessing innocent suffering of all sorts, innocent vulnerabilities of all kinds. But I believe that by looking back to some of the historical issues of how Catholic social teaching has tried to deal with the crises of environmental issues, it may give us some clues as to how to deal with this particular crisis that we have at the moment. So I'm going to turn then to the Pope Paul VI, the apostolic letter written in May 1971, which was around only shortly after Rachel Carson's book on Silent Spring, where she, if you like, energized many scientists and others to be aware of some of the important environmental considerations that were around at the time. In this book, in this letter, the environmental impacts are named as the dramatic and unexpected consequence of human activity, as well as an inconsidered exploitation of nature. Of course, climate change is not mentioned in this letter because it was too early for the awareness of that to be around at the time. But what's named as the dramatic and unexpected consequence of human activity, I would say, does apply to climate change. Certainly human-induced or anthropogenic climate change is expected according to scientists, but it's not the extent and the scale of the change is not something we could have predicted. What is not as obvious is who is responsible, taking responsibility. In other words, it's not necessarily a considered exploitation of the natural world, but it's, if you like, the decisions that we make then have impacts that then lead to a sense of ill consideration. It also doesn't yet take in the consideration of sociological and economic issues. That's to come later as we go into what's sometimes known as the tragedy of the commons. That comes much later in encyclicals. But for the moment, what's named is this a sense of human responsibility for our actions. But why should theologians in particular be concerned about this issue? And in order to look into this in more detail, I believe we need to look at theological reasons or theological mandates behind this particular question. And right from the very moment of Pope John Paul II's encyclical Redemptor Hominis, he started to name environmental questions and develop the theological link between Christ and creation. Christ in divine humanity reconciles the broken earth and also reconciles broken humanity. So this link of restoration, if you like, of healing, as it were, the brokenness, comes in this particular encyclical. And now here's a direct quote. In Jesus Christ, the visible world which God created for man, or humanity if you prefer, the world that when sin entered was subject to futility, and that's a quotation from Romans 8, recovers again its original link with the divine source of wisdom and love. So in other words, Jesus Christ is the source of wisdom and love, not just for humanity, but the whole visible world, the whole of the created world. And while this is still just a sketch, it is, if you like, putting Christology into the heart of why we need to be concerned about environmental questions. He also linked different areas of social concern through the cross of Christ. So we have the destruction of the environment named as primary, and that's significant to point out. Also nuclear war at the time, and still a threat. Lack of respect for the unborn, and unbridled use of new technologies. All these were interconnected as far as Pope John Paul was concerned. So, but all are, if you like, in some sense linked with the suffering of the man on the cross, Jesus Christ. So ecological concern then is rooted in a profound basis on which other injustices start to take their shape. Eco-awareness on this basis is not just an optional extra for those who might name themselves as eco-warriors, but the calling of every Christian. And this is something I can't repeat often enough, that it should be part of the teaching of every Christian community to talk about these interconnected areas of devastation and concern. As we move on in time, as it were, through Catholic social teaching, we start to find a much greater consciousness of the link between ecology and development. And those most vulnerable to current impacts of climate change are also the poorest in society. And that's one of the reasons why CAFOD, the official Catholic development agency of England and Wales, asked me to help them with their area of sustainability that was following up from their Live Simply program, Live Simply in Solidarity and Sustainably. And it was the sustainability area that was the most confusing to members of the congregations. But there's no reason to be confused once you start recognizing, as it were, the close link between the devastation of the earth and also the possibility for human flourishing in the poorest regions of the world. As we know, the focus on different regions of the globe have a differential impact as far as climate change goes. And the poorest areas of the earth, especially areas around Africa and low-lying regions of Bangladesh, are the most vulnerable in terms of impact. I'm using development here not because I'm not uncritical of the use of the term, but because it's used in the encyclical statements. We can have a discussion about that at the end of the talk, if you wish, as to whether the word development is appropriate or not. But what it means, what's behind that word, is an integral sense of development that's not just about human beings, but also about wider environmental flourishing as well. So when we come to the encyclical Solicitudo Res Socialis, written in 1987, we find that, first of all, that super-development is criticized, but also the specific image of the human being as the gardener appears. And I think that is very significant. It harks back to the Genesis text, which speaks of the goodness of the created world. And the right dominion, further, is the means to express true divine image bearing, or imago Dei. In other words, if we are to bear the image of God, then we are to be like God, as gardener, as it were, of the created world in which we live. And this is a shared task of image bearing for both men and women. It's not simply for the male of the species. It's extended to the whole of the human community. And the sociality itself is extended to all of life and not just human life. And so gardening has to be not just gardening of our own specific whim or will, but in conformity to the divine law and in obedience to that law as well, as a means of perfection. So right image bearing is the means through which we become perfect in the likeness of God. And I can't think of a better mandate for environmental responsibility than that. So it's the way, as it were, the way of perfection that many of the mystics and other writers have talked about. Now comes the way of acting in the world, a way of particular acting in the world. But what happens if humanity fails? And this is also something that's touched on in this encyclical as well. And what I think is a remarkable statement, because it's often talked about in some of the more radical eco-theologies that we find abroad today, talks about the agency of nature. So when human beings rebel against the divine mandate, nature rebels against him and no longer recognizes him as its master, for he has tarnished the divine image in himself. Now, of course, this is using the word personifying nature in mythological personification terms. But at the same time, I think that this recognition of rebellion, as it were, chimes with something that we feel in climate change, where the natural world seems to be almost out of control, certainly out of control of our own human abilities to contain what is going on. As we move to the next encyclical that I'm going to mention, Centesimus Annus, written in 1991. Here it is the task of the state to provide for the defence and preservation of the common goods, such as the natural and the human environments, which cannot be safeguarded simply by market forces. So it's drawing here on the ecological consequences of improper consumerism. And in this sense, integral development includes environmental goods as well as the goods of the in the economic sphere. The earth is God's gift to the human race without discrimination, and this is the foundation, as it were, of the term common good. So if we bandy around the term common good in our Catholic social teaching and the way we use it in the different parts of this university, we need to remember that the fundamental basis of the common good is the gift of the earth. And again, I'm not sure whether that's as widely appreciated or acknowledged as it should be. Of course, there isn't a specific engagement with the market economy at this stage, but it does open the door at least to the possible critique or modification or interrogation, as it were, of what a new kind of market economy might be like. The foundation of the common good is spelt out a little bit later in this encyclical, where we read, "The original source of all that is good is the very act of God, who created both the earth and man." You can read humanity for that. This is an English translation using that language, so earth and humanity. "And who gave the earth to humanity so that they might have dominion over it by their work and enjoy its fruits," drawing again on the Genesis text, the text of creation. "God gave the earth to the whole human race for the sustenance of all its members without excluding or favouring anyone. This is the foundation of the universal destination of the earth's goods." So this is the foundation of the common good. The earth, by reason of its fruitfulness and its capacity to satisfy human needs, is God's first gift for the sustenance of human life. So the understanding of the earth as created gift provides the basis of the common good on which all other common goods can be worked out. And there is a need for cooperation in order to have proper relationships with the earth. Stewardship is also, the language of stewardship is also used, and while that has some managerial overtones, it is at least trying to edge towards a sense of human responsibility. What we find then is the natural world is the gift to the whole human race, and what is licit is dominion over the earth, but what is illicit is unbridled consumerism. It resists then the Western temptation to desire and enjoy rather than to be and to grow, and that's a direct quotation from this encyclical. Humanity consumes the resources of the earth and his own life in an excessive and disordered way. That's Centissimus Annus, paragraph 37. It is rooted, according to this encyclical, in an anthropological error, where the power to create is not acknowledged through God's prior gift of creation or original gift of being. So the respect for the natural world requires an understanding of God-given purposes in the natural order. Too little then is effort is made then to safeguard the moral conditions for an authentic human ecology. And this is why the language of human ecology, when it appears, shouldn't be surprising to us, because it's been filtering, as it were, through these encyclicals all the way until this point. Of course, we can ask ourselves what he meant by human ecology. And that is what I'm going to do next. And it appears on a number of occasions, but in Evangelium Vitae, which was published in 1995, it's spelt out very clearly as in terms of the ecological question. The ecological question ranging from the preservation of natural habitats of different species of animals and other forms of life to human ecology, properly speaking, which finds in the Bible clear and strong ethical direction, leading to a solution which respects the good of life, of every life. So human ecology isn't simply a turn to nature, it's about a respect for life and the ground on which all that life exists. Once we start to look at the work of Benedict XVI, his understanding of human ecology gets translated into a social ecology. And a social ecology, which is expressed in his World Day Message of Peace in 2007, cites Centissimus Annus as well, and names the political and economic conditions for human and all other life, flourishing of all other life. And it's one of the reasons why I'm showing this slide, is because Benedict, more than Pope John Paul II perhaps, started to try and implement what it meant to express human ecology by putting solar panels on his roof of the Vatican. So it became the first carbon neutral state ever. Of course, you could say that's it was much easier for him than any other state, but never mind. And I also won't tell you that it was a German solar panel organisation that donated these cells, but anyway, that's just an aside. The fact that he permitted it to be on the roof of the Vatican and enabling Vatican to be the first carbon neutral state, I think is important. In his writings in Caritas in Veritate, the market system is kept more or less intact, but he does hint at the economy of gratuitousness. It's not really spelt out exactly what that means, except that it's in terms of gift relationships. Gift founded, of course, in the gift of creation. Now, it's up to economists and others to work out what that might mean in real terms. But then we have to ask ourselves, well, how do we move from the ideal, as it were, from where we are now in terms of the mess that we might be in? Can any change ever be possible? And in order to fill this out, the understanding of Pope John Paul II's ecological conversion, I think, is relevant. Because here, he goes back to, if you like, the root, or what he sees as the moral root of the problem, which is rooted in our own desires for self-interested desires. So his call to ecological conversion is one that he mentions on a number of occasions. And I'm going to mention one in Pastoris Gregis, which was specifically for the bishops of the church. And I think it's significant that he asked the bishops this question, because in here he's talking to the, if you like, the main pastors of the flock. And so therefore he's saying that this is what you need to tell your congregations. This is the way we should go in the future. So there's a need for ecological conversion, to which bishops themselves can contribute by their teaching about the correct relationships of human beings with nature. Seen in the light of the doctrine of God the Father, the maker of heaven and earth, this relationship is one of stewardships. Human beings are set at the center of creation as stewards of the Creator. So we, if you like, we mirror, it goes back to this idea of mirroring the gardening image that we found in some of the earlier encyclicals. But at the same time, the foundation of ecological conversion is not ecology as such, but it's Christology. It's Christology, and the reason for this is what I would call, he doesn't use this term, by the way, but I'm calling it this, deep incarnation. So conversion is also conversion to Christ, because, as in Dominem Vivicantum says this, the firstborn of all creation, becoming incarnate in the individual humanity of Christ, unites himself in some way with the entire reality of humanity, which is also flesh, and in this reality with all flesh, that is, with the whole creation. So it goes back to that early message that I told you about Christ being the divine source of wisdom and love for all creation and not just humanity. So it's a cosmic Christology, which actually is very ancient. It's not a modern eco-theological invention. It goes back to the early church, the cosmic Christology of Maximus the Confessor and other early church fathers. It's also made explicit in Bartholomew II, the Patriarchate Bartholomew II, and Pope John Paul II's joint declaration written in 2001. And here he says, a solution at the economic and the technological level can be found only if we undergo, in the most radical way, an inner change of heart, which can lead to a change in lifestyle and of unsustainable patterns of consumption and production. A genuine conversion in Christ will enable us to change the way we think and act. So in order to move from, if you like, our unsustainable desires and practices to ones which are more, if you like, in line with a proper respect for the natural world and each other, we have to undergo a conversion to Christ. And this dominion over the earth, sometimes understood in a one-sided and superficial way, seems to leave no room for mercy. So in this sense, the mercy of God is kept uppermost in his understanding, not just of mercy in relation to one another, but also mercy in relation to the natural world as well. Why is this important? I think it's important because the world as we know it is not all that it should be. It also has practical implications for global security, a matter that we're going to look at tomorrow. In other words, it's not just something which is of interest and concern for theologians or those who are religious. It's also a matter of global security, of global peacemaking. And it's one of the reasons why this has been part of the message of the World Day Messages of Peace ever since 1990. So maybe even before that, but I haven't checked them all. But certainly in 1990, Pope John Paul II's Peace with Creation explicitly mentions the need for linking peace with the natural world with a wider sense of global stability and peacemaking. So for the last 23 years, this issue of peacemaking and security has been part of the message of Catholic social teaching. In 2010, Pope Benedict XVI also mentions climate change explicitly, including the problem of environmental refugees. And he says this: these are people who are forced by the degradation of their natural habitat to forsake it, and often their possessions as well, in order to face the dangers and uncertainties of forced displacement. So if we're concerned for social issues and we're concerned for poverty and displacement, we need to also be concerned about environmental injustices, because this is what he's naming, is environmental injustice, the disproportionate suffering of those in the poorest regions of the world. I will just very briefly mention the 2001 US Roman Catholic Bishops' Dialogue, Prudence and the Common Good letter, because here prudence is summarized as intelligence as applied to action. I think this is too thin a version of what prudence really means, and if people want to go further than that, I can talk about my own interest in virtue ethics and practical wisdom. But it does, I think, help us give guidance into how we are to make very difficult choices and difficult decisions in areas such as climate change. And I'm coming towards the end now. I couldn't give a talk of this kind without mentioning Pope Francis. And so the last part of this talk, I'm going to mention some of the things that he said very, very recently. This, of course, is a fairly superficial analysis of what the significance of what he might say next. But one of these quotes is also at the beginning of your program today. We also see the core of the Christian vocation, which is Christ. So again, Christ is central to Pope Francis as well as to Pope John Paul II and to Benedict. But let us protect Christ in our lives so that we can protect others, so that we can protect creation. The vocation of being a protector, however, is not just something involving us as Christians alone. It also has a prior dimension which is simply human, involving everyone. It means protecting all of creation, the beauty of the created world, as the book of Genesis tells us and as St. Francis of Assisi showed us. Be protectors of God's gifts. And that was at his inaugural Mass of 19th of March. And I think from the moment of his inauguration, this need for protection and care of creation was one of the central messages. And he spells out why he names Francis as his namesake, as it were, in naming himself as Francis. There were three reasons for this. One is the priority for those who are poor. The second, because of world peace. And then the third, because of creation. And in a sense, he's offering, as it were, a mandate for all that I've said in this lecture, linking those three areas, linking those who are poor, world peace, and creation. And Francis teaches us, this is a quote from him again, teaches us profound respect for the whole of creation and the protection of the environment, which all too often, instead of using for good, we exploit greedily to one another's detriment. So the link then between Christ and creation becomes explicit here as well. And you've seen this one as well already, so I'm just going to pass over this quite quickly. Please, I'd ask all those to be positions of responsibility in economic, political and social life. Let us be protectors of creation. So it's a call, it's a mandate to get involved, to protect creation, to protect every man and every woman, to look upon them with tenderness and love, is to open up a horizon of hope. It is to let a shaft of light break through the heavy clouds. It is to bring the warmth of hope. So harking back perhaps on to the encyclical that Benedict wrote on hope, he says this, that we aren't left with the sense of misery and despair and anxiety which climate change so often can lead to. We have to hold on to the hope that we have in the faith in order to move in the direction of protection of each other and protection of the world in which we live. He then invites all to share in the ministry of hope to which he is called. So, to quote, "The star of hope may shine more brightly, and we may protect with love all that God has given us." This, of course, is a huge challenge. The call for ecological solidarity, and as well as solidarity with one another, and how that might work out in terms of peacemaking is left vague. But I think it still can be taken up and used in different local contexts and absorbed and incorporated. The challenge, whether we go for mitigation and adaptation, is dealt with, I think, in this approach, because it's not simply one or another. It's about both and. Catholic social teaching has sometimes been criticised for whether it's focusing too much on humanity. I don't think that's a valid criticism, because throughout what is emphasised is the creation basis for our own human lives and the need, if you like, for human beings to start to change their ways of acting and being. Humanity then, as far as I'm concerned, is the root of the problem. We are living in the age of the Anthropocene, so it's only by changing our own human activities that we can expect changes to take place on the global sphere. Ecological justice needs to be joined up with environmental justice if we to care for the earth in a way that respects the biodiversity that's slipping away from us. And I was glad that in the introduction to my talk we had insights into ecology. In our concern over climate change, I don't think we should leave our ecological instincts behind. In other words, it's not just about habitat or environment, but it's also about seeing the richness of the biodiversity around us and what that might mean for us, both as Christians and as Catholics. And with that, thank you very much.
We now have time for questions. If you would use the microphone, if possible.
No? Am I? Hi, Dr. Drummond, Marcus Walden from University of St. Thomas in Houston. I'm studying environmental science and theology. And I'm interested in, you talked about the idea of dominion in there, and I'm wondering if you could possibly just expand on kind of the traditional Catholic idea of dominion in creation, and then how the modern notion of that has possibly caused like the misappropriation of the goods as a human environment.
Okay. One of the pieces of paragraphs in my paper that I took out because I wanted to leave enough time for discussion was what I would call the slippage in the language of dominion, because actually in places in Catholic social teaching we don't find the language of dominion, we actually find the language of domination. And that has been worrying for many people. And I think it's a sort of leftover, an unthoughtful residue, as it were, of prior attitudes to the natural world, that it was simply for our usefulness. And I would say that the newer attitude of understanding the natural world as gift means that dominion can never be understood as any kind of exploitation. In my own work, I have criticised the understanding of stewardship as being adequate to meet the particular demands of ecological ethics. But I think that if the language of stewardship at least gives what I would call a mediating principle to allow people to start to get concerned, it's better than nothing. I think that there are managerial overtones in the language of stewardship that we can criticise. I think that we need to push further in terms of ecological solidarity, but I think the image of Francis, for example, does do that. In other words, it starts to push forward in the direction that I would see a Catholic approach to ecological ethics needing to go, and that is a greater sense of the unity of people with other beings, and a greater sense of what you might call their intrinsic value, rather than seeing them as simply instruments for human usefulness. So of course there are aspects of Catholic social teaching that haven't dealt with this properly. But I think we need to draw on those which are more promising and try and build on that, and also stress what I would call the cosmic Christological dimension, because that in a sense is inescapable. If Christ is the distinguishing mark of Christians over against other religions, it's beholden on us, as it were, to understand what the significance of Christology is. And if it is that Christ is the link between God and creation in the way that we understand Christ to be, then it means that for every Christian we have a mandate for environmental responsibility. So we cannot escape that on whatever our particular political position or whatever our particular approach to the market, as it were. It's beholden on all of us to have a sense of what that responsibility might entail. Now, I might push for a more, how should we say, a radical understanding of what that implies for ecological issues, but I think it's implicit in there. I don't think it's parting from the main message that I see starting to surface. And in that sense, I see it as part of a trajectory, a sign of the Spirit working in the world of Catholic social teaching. If you like, it's where it's pointing to. It's the prophetic voice, as it were, that's coming to the surface, and even in the midst of these rather long and difficult documents. So I don't lose heart when I lose these. I think that some eco-theologians have bashed Catholic social teaching and said it's far too anthropocentric to be useful. I think Donald Doer's recent book, The Option for the Earth and the Option for the Poor and the Option for the Earth, is very interesting, because although he's critical of much of Catholic social teaching, he does come round to the idea that perhaps there is this environmental agenda going on there now, and I've had a number of discussions with him about that as well. So I think that it's, I think we need to face up to some of the other, what I would call the less helpful aspects of it, if we are taking this into our teaching ministry of some sort. But I think for the moment we can say, well, these are the basic frameworks in which we can think through what the issue might entail.
Stefan from Modena University. Thank you very much for such an explicit explanation of the work on global climate and also its relationship to Christianity. I think you have outlined very important religious aspects of the problem that I personally was not so much aware of since I came to this conference. In particular, I was impressed by the presentation earlier on by our students who gave me the impression that we really have to teach within our curriculum the aspects of global climate change and also its relationship to religions. My question is this. It looks like what you mentioned was Pope Francis highlighted the problem as it is not just a Catholic problem, but it is a problem for all Christianity and all human beings. Now, are there any efforts to indulge other Christians into the problem and also other religions in an effort to have a world view of the problem and lay down the foundation to solve some of the problems that are very challenging to the human race right now?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm glad you asked that question. A long time ago, back in, it was around the early 90s, I was working with the International Consultancy on Religion, Education and Culture, which is a multi-faith organization explicitly concerned with linking ecology and religion. One of the things that they organized was a joint declaration for action on the environment by the different world religions, and they met in Assisi. And that joint declaration then went on to form the Alliance of Religion and Conservation, which is run by Martin Palmer, who I used to work for before I went to the University of Chester. And so, if you like, there are public and grassroots movements that are going on that form these alliances. The alliance between Pope John Paul II and Bartholomew I, Bartholomew was one that I mentioned, the Orthodox Ecumenical Patriarchate. There are also signs that Benedict and others have collaborated with some of the leaderships in the Muslim world and so on. So I would say that if you're going to engage in interreligious dialogue, this area of ecology is one of the best ways of actually engaging in that dialogue, because it's a shared global concern, and it's also one that, if you like, we cannot solve unilaterally. So the reason I focused in on Catholic social teaching today was because I thought it was important to flag up the importance of understanding the Catholic tradition. But that's not to say that I don't think that it should be dealt with by other Christian denominations or by other religious traditions. I've engaged in dialogue with Muslim scholars myself, and Jewish scholars. And I think that once we understand what that tradition is, I think that a focus, say, on Christology isn't offensive to those of other religious traditions, as long as we're honest and appreciative of what they want to say, as it were, from their particular tradition. So I've never found that a barrier. I know that Ian Barber and some of those in the science and religion dialogue have soft-pedaled aspects of Christology in order to make it more palatable, supposedly, in the ecumenical dialogue with other religious traditions. I don't find that approach necessarily works. I've found in my conversations with Muslims that actually, if you're upfront about your own understanding of Christology, they do find that very interesting. So they don't want it to be, if you like, adjusted in order to make the message more easily palatable for those kind of conversations. So I think that the focus in on social issues, specifically the issues of poverty and climate change and ecological devastation, is one of the most fruitful areas for interreligious dialogue and discussion. I haven't done as much of it as I might have yet, but there are others who are doing that, and I certainly would support that. We can, by the gestures that Francis has made towards the Muslims on the Maundy Thursday Mass, perhaps we can see more of that in the future.
Richard Brown, St. Francis of Assisi Parish in Ann Arbor. I see, and you brought out many, many more documents than I was familiar with. From the popes have talked about this for quite some time. My concern is, and with our own parish, we've been working on it very actively, but I'm not seeing it so much from the diocese and various dioceses. It seems like, or I go to parishes, various places around the country, and I don't hear it. Now, admittedly, I'm only here or there, but I don't hear it in the homilies, and I'm not seeing it get down, particularly in the United States. Why isn't it being heard more? Where the popes have been talking about it.
Uh-huh. Yeah, well, I don't want to steal the thunder from our panelists who are going to be probably talking far more about this than I have the expertise myself. My own instinct is that there's ignorance about this particular link between Christ and creation and the importance of environmental and social problems in the encyclicals. It's a hidden gem, as it were. People talk about it as the world's best kept secret, and use other language that people haven't got the time to go through some of these encyclicals. What is, I think, promising is that because Francis has now named himself as Pope Francis and has given the very simple message of protect the poor, world peace and creation, that simple message has to sink in. And I've actually noticed in the parish in Princeton that I go to that suddenly the environment has come into homilies in the last few weeks in a way that probably wouldn't have done otherwise. So, maybe it's been now crystallized in the inauguration of Pope Francis. So that's maybe a hopeful sign that things may start to change finally. But there's also, I think, a huge or a crushing sense of so many different and interconnected problems, and sometimes this problem of environmental issues just seems too big to even start to be tackled in the local sphere. But I think that where I come from, up till a few years ago in England, there are grassroots movements among parishes. There are movements to be both environmentally responsible. Something called Operation Noah, which is about trying to green the churches. Admittedly, not many Catholic churches are involved, but there are, back to the question that we have just now, there are many good examples of grassroots movements that are actively pursuing environmental responsibility in the local context. There's also, interestingly enough, the Churchyards project in England as well, which deals with greening the churchyards and making them sites of ecological restoration, rather than, so in other words, bringing back some of the biodiversity that has been there before, because they are, if you like, sites which cannot be tampered with in the normal development sense, because they hold graves. So there are various imaginative projects, and of course the Alliance on Religion and Conservation has a huge network of grassroots activism going on. Roger Gottlieb is a religious studies scholar who has emphasized the combination of grassroots and top-down involvement in some of these issues. And by talking about what I would call official teaching, I don't want to undermine or diminish the importance of grassroots activism. I think it's essential. In addition to that, through CAFOD, the Catholic Fund for Overseas Development, we can start introducing the language of solidarity with those who are poor, but also show how much of their suffering is related to climate impacts. I went out to Tanzania myself in 2010 and visited a number of sites, including sites where those particular people were reliant on condensing water vapor coming from steam from some of the volcanic sort of fissures in the volcanic area where they lived, and the Maasai tribe, which was part of this, were extremely grateful. And what was interesting is that they had been evangelized by, I think, a Pentecostal or some sort of Protestant evangelical group a few years before, and so they saw our turning up as a direct action of God. They greeted us in terms that you'd only anticipate in the New Testament. I was completely shocked, but I mean, they started wanting our blessing. They blessed us, as it were. So it was actually a completely different kind of scenario than you might have expected. There was no sense of anger or sense of injustice. Why are we the poorest of the poor? But just a sense of overwhelming gratitude for life, and gratitude for the water that they were now able to use, clean water, both to allow themselves to survive and their livestock. And I've written about this in a book called Religion and Ecology in the Public Sphere, which wasn't mentioned, but then if you are interested in following that up, there is a chapter in that book on that particular experience. So I think that all these kind of experiences also feed into the way we think about theology as well as Catholic social teaching. But the social teaching is there as a kind of frame within which we can either resist in places but also engage with, at least in terms of where we might develop theologically.
Thank you so much for your presentation and all of the work that you've done. Could you said you could speak more in the discussion period about your own theology of practical wisdom and prudence. Could you, I'd be interested in hearing more about that.
Okay. Yeah, I could do a new lecture on practical wisdom or prudence. What I try and do is draw on the work of Thomas Aquinas and his different facets of prudence, including what I think is very important, deliberation, judgment, and action. That's how he understands prudence. And the deliberative phase includes memoria, or having a memory of the things of the past. It also includes being circumspection, that is being aware of the particular issues, in this case the issues of climate change, what they actually are in practical terms. It also includes insight and reason. So in other words, it's a fairly, and also includes foresight, that is being able to predict what might happen in the future. So if you look at if you want, what you might call the classic understanding of prudence, I think it has all the elements that we might mean in order to make good decisions in very complicated situations. Now, it would have to be localized in terms of a concrete example come to the surface in a particular local community. But you could also apply it at the political level as well, because as well as individual prudence, Aquinas also talks about familial prudence and political prudence. And so political prudence can help us adjudicate in some of those very difficult problems that we heard from Stephen Gardiner this morning. And as a virtue ethicist himself, I'm sort of warm to some of that, but I'm not sure whether he has unpacked all these different intricacies of practical wisdom and prudence. And just one other thing. So far what I've said might sound fairly Aristotelian, but I think there's also the element of grace, which is so important in prudence, that we have this, Aquinas has this notion of infused prudence, infused by grace, which is something of an embarrassment in the past for some philosophers. But it's now beginning to come back. People are beginning to say, well, we cannot just ignore this. And so an overreaction has been, well, he's not Aristotelian even, he's just so filled of grace, you know. But that, I think, is taking it to the other extreme. So I think he adjudicates between the secular, that is the Aristotelian as he understands it, and the theological. And I think that kind of dialogue or ability to hold on to both strands in one area of thinking is extremely useful. And although I haven't written a book yet explicitly on environmental ethics and sustainability, although I have written a book called The Ethics of Nature that dealt with different aspects of the natural world and what it means, it is my intention to develop that more next. So, you know, some 5 years away you might see something more on that.
And our final question will probably be asked by a Franciscan sister.
Yes, thank you. I'm a Franciscan Sister of the Eucharist, Sister Damien Marie Savino, and I'm chair of the Environmental Science Department at University of St. Thomas in Houston. Also have a joint appointment in Catholic Studies, so I very much appreciated your presentation, especially the Christ-centered aspect. I'd kind of like to follow up on the former question, because sometimes with my students, in terms of trying to help them be active, you know, on campus and hands-on initiatives and make things really happen, I've tried to frame it in light of virtue ethics, you know, even simple things like recycling as being an exercise of virtue in a sense. So I wondered, you mentioned prudence. Could you say a little bit more about how this might, say, be in a curriculum, or you know, how we could use virtue ethics actually for practically instructing our young people?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of prudence is interesting, not for all people, even scientists, because they always come up against difficult problems that they cannot solve. So I think that practical wisdom is both proactive in terms of what we need to do, but also proactive in terms of what we resist. So there's a sense of resisting some of the pressures of consumerism that we've heard throughout this morning. It's also about being proactive in making decisions, particular choices, which are more environmentally responsible. At the same time, I'm aware that we repeatedly fail and that we don't always live up to the goals that we may have. But I think that prudence helps us to be realistic as well in that. And so it's about it's a kind of cultural wisdom that comes from experience, but it also can be taught. So certainly the biblical understanding of wisdom is something that is learned in the family, but it also can be taught through education. And so on that basis, I would say, and I gave a talk a year or so ago, which was the whole conference was on wisdom in the university for the 21st century. And my own talk was on the need for a theological wisdom in the university at large. So I you know, that I'm happy to send you that paper. It'd be interesting. But I think that especially in a university like Notre Dame, it's very important to include a religious and a theological aspect of what we do in terms of what it means to act prudently, and how that could, if you like, shape not just our own narrow curriculum and recycling and all those other practical things, but also the curriculum at large. In other words, the big questions about how we structure the curriculum as a whole, and the decisions that we make, and you know, the choices that we have, you know, to run certain conferences and others and so on. So these are the big questions where I think the need for practical wisdom is so important. And in addition to that, although I lean towards virtue ethics, I also think that the particular virtue ethics of prudence is useful because it talks about political prudence, and I think that the looking at big structural issues of why we're in the mess we're in, is also very important and very challenging for students. So, in other words, if we're not careful, the recycling can become a form of environmental indulgence. In other words, it's salving our consciences and telling, of course, we're doing the right thing in one level, but if that's all we do, then it may not really be enough. So I think I would want to push students to think not just about their own individual actions, but also look at the bigger picture, the bigger questions of economics and social lives and so on at the wider level, the global as well as the local.
Before we thank our speaker, I just have one announcement about the schedule. If the coffee break ends at 2:45, if we could reconvene at that point at the end of the coffee break at 2:45 at the start of our next session. With that, let us now thank our speaker.